The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with wax that bore the Shaw family crest. Sterling Rhodes read it twice, then set it down carefully on his oak desk. He had asked for a wife. They were sending him Clementine. But something felt wrong about the way they wrote her name. Sterling had met the Shaw daughters once, 3 years ago, at a trading post. Beautiful girls, all of them, with their mother's golden hair and their father's sharp blue eyes. Yet the letter mentioned none of this. Instead, it spoke of practical qualities and suitable temperament. The words felt hollow, like echoes in an empty barn. He walked to the window and stared at the dusty road that led to his ranch. In 2 days, she would arrive, the woman his careful inquiry had requested, the daughter the Shaw family had chosen to send. What Sterling didn't know was that back at the Shaw homestead, Clementine was packing her few belongings while her sisters laughed in the next room. He didn't know that her father had called it perfect justice when Sterling's letter arrived asking for a bride. He didn't know that her mother had smiled for the first time in weeks when they decided which daughter to send. And he certainly didn't know that Clementine Shaw carried a secret that would explain why her family was so eager to see her gone. A secret that connected her to Sterling Rhodes in ways that would change everything he thought he knew about his carefully planned future. The wagon would arrive Thursday at sunset, but the real mystery would begin long before then. Sterling spent Wednesday morning cleaning his house with an intensity that surprised even him. He swept dust from corners that hadn't seen a broom in months, polished the wooden table until it gleamed, and arranged the chairs just so. The small bedroom at the back of the house received fresh linens and a vase he'd found buried in his late mother's trunk. He paused at the mirror hanging near the front door, running a hand through his dark hair. At 28, he owned more land than most men twice his age, but something fundamental had always been missing. The silence in his house felt heavier each passing year, like a weight pressing against his chest. The memory came unbidden, as it often did. 3 years ago at Peterson's trading post, he'd been loading supplies when laughter drew his attention. 3 young women stood near a wagon, their blonde hair catching the afternoon sun like spun gold. The oldest had been arranging fabric with practiced grace, the middle daughter chatting animatedly with a merchant. But it was the youngest who had captured his notice. She'd been crouched beside a wounded dog, her dress already stained with mud and blood, speaking in low, soothing tones, while her sisters called impatiently for her to leave the animal alone. Her hands had been gentle but sure as she wrapped the creature's injured paw with strips torn from her own petticoat. When she finally stood, her face had been streaked with dirt, her hair disheveled, but her eyes held a warmth that had stayed with him long after their wagon disappeared down the dusty road. That had been Clementine Shaw, the girl her father introduced with a dismissive wave as our youngest, while her mother's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Sterling remembered how quickly they'd hurried her away from the injured animal, how her sisters had laughed at her stained dress, but he'd been watching her face when she thought no one was looking, and what he'd seen there had haunted him ever since. A deep sadness that seemed too heavy for someone so young, as if she carried burdens that weren't rightfully hers. Now, as he straightened a picture frame for the 3rd time, Sterling wondered what had happened in the years since that day. The letter from her father had been strangely formal, almost eager in its tone. Most families required extensive courtship before considering marriage arrangements. Yet Charles Shaw had responded to Sterling's inquiry with unusual haste. The afternoon sun slanted through his windows, casting long shadows across the spotless floor. Tomorrow she would arrive, and with her would come answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. But one thing troubled him more than all the rest. In his memory of that day, he could still see the way Clementine's family had looked at her, as if she were something to be endured rather than cherished. Whatever brought her to his doorstep, Sterling suspected it had less to do with love and more to do with something her family was desperate to hide. 2 days earlier, the Shaw family had gathered around their kitchen table like conspirators planning a heist. Charles Shaw held Sterling's letter in his weathered hands, reading it for the 4th time since it had arrived that morning. His wife Margaret sat rigid in her chair, her blue eyes bright with something that might have been relief. "A rancher," she said, her voice carefully measured, "and a prosperous one from what we've heard." Their oldest daughter, Victoria, leaned forward with interest. "The same Sterling Rhodes who bought the Morrison place? Father, he must own half the county by now. Which makes this perfect," their middle daughter Isabel added with a laugh that held no warmth. "Poor Clementine. She has no idea what's coming, does she?" Charles set the letter down and looked toward the back of the house, where Clementine was tending their ailing grandmother. "She doesn't need to know the details. It's better this way. Margaret's fingers drummed against the wooden table. 3 years we've been waiting for an opportunity like this. 3 years of watching her become more of a problem every day. Mother, Victoria warned, glancing toward the door. She might hear you. Let her hear, Margaret snapped. That girl has brought nothing but shame to this family since she turned 16. At least now she'll be someone else's burden. The truth was that Clementine Shaw had indeed become a problem, but not in the way most families might expect from their youngest daughter. While her sisters had learned to simper and blush at appropriate moments, Clementine had developed an unfortunate tendency toward honesty. When the banker's son had tried to cheat their neighbor out of his land, she'd spoken up. When the preacher's wife had been skimming money from the church fund, Clementine had quietly gathered proof and presented it to the congregation. Each incident had been small in itself, but together, they'd created a reputation that followed her family like a dark cloud. People had begun to look at the Shaws with suspicion, wondering what other uncomfortable truths their youngest daughter might uncover. She asks too many questions, Charles muttered, running his hand through his graying hair. Always watching, always listening. It's not natural for a young woman. Isabel stood and moved to the window, watching as Clementine hung laundry on the line behind their house. Remember what happened with the Henderson contract? We would have made a fortune if she hadn't started asking where the money was coming from. Victoria nodded grimly. Or the incident with Judge Morrison's nephew. We could have had connections in the territorial government if she hadn't insisted on speaking up about his drinking problem. Margaret's expression hardened. This marriage arrangement solves everything. Sterling Rhodes lives 40 miles from here, far enough that her meddling won't affect our business dealings. And if he's as taken with pretty young wives as the rumors suggest, he'll keep her busy enough that she won't have time to cause trouble. Charles folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket. Tomorrow morning we'll tell her about the engagement. She'll leave Thursday as planned. But none of them knew that Clementine had been standing just outside the kitchen door for the past 5 minutes, listening to every word they'd spoken. Clementine pressed her back against the wooden wall outside the kitchen, her heart pounding so hard she was certain her family would hear it through the thin boards. The words echoed in her mind like stones dropped into a deep well. Burden, shame, problem to be solved. She closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. Part of her wanted to storm into that kitchen and confront them all, to demand explanations for the years of cold shoulders and disappointed sighs. But another part, the part that had learned to survive in a house where love was rationed like water during a drought, told her to think carefully before acting. 3 years ago, when she'd helped that injured dog at Peterson's trading post, her mother had slapped her hand away from the animal and hissed that decent young ladies didn't soil themselves with such nonsense. Her sisters had spent the entire ride home commenting on her stained dress, her wild hair, her complete lack of proper feminine sensibilities. But she remembered something else from that day. A tall, dark-haired man loading supplies had been watching her tend to the wounded animal. While her family had looked at her with their usual mixture of embarrassment and irritation, his expression had been different, thoughtful, almost appreciative. That had been Sterling Rhodes, though she hadn't learned his name until much later when other folks mentioned the young rancher who'd been buying up land and building something impressive out in the Western Territory. Clementine heard chairs scraping against the kitchen floor and quickly moved away from the door, slipping around the side of the house before her family emerged. She needed time to think, to plan, to decide how she would handle this new information. Her grandmother's bedroom was quiet and dim, heavy curtains blocking most of the afternoon light. The old woman lay still beneath her quilts, her breathing shallow but steady. Clementine pulled a chair close to the bed and took her grandmother's weathered hand in her own. "I heard them talking, Grandmama," she whispered, though she knew the older woman could no longer respond. "They're sending me away, to marry a man I've never spoken to, all because they think I caused too much trouble." She thought about the Henderson contract her family had wanted her to ignore, the money that had appeared in their accounts with no clear explanation of its source. She thought about Judge Morrison's nephew and his midnight visits to the saloon, the bruises she'd seen on his wife's arms, the way her own father had warned her to mind her business when she'd tried to speak up. Maybe she did ask too many questions. Maybe she did see things that were easier left unexamined. But she'd watched her father shake hands with men who left honest families homeless, seen her mother smile sweetly while counting money earned through others' misfortune. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her straighten. Tomorrow morning they would tell her about Sterling Rhodes and the marriage arrangement. expecting her to accept their decision with the meek gratitude they'd never bothered to earn. But Clementine Shaw had spent 22 years learning to read the truth behind people's words, and she was done pretending she couldn't see what was right in front of her. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem sharper, more real. Clementine sat at the breakfast table while her father cleared his throat and delivered the news she'd already heard through thin walls. She nodded at appropriate moments, asked the questions they expected, and accepted their explanations with the quiet resignation they'd come to expect from their youngest daughter. "Sterling Rhodes is a good man," Charles said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "You'll want for nothing." "And it's time you married," Margaret added with forced brightness. 22 is quite old to still be living under your parents' roof." Victoria and Isabel exchanged glances across the table, their expressions carefully neutral. They'd perfected the art of looking innocent when cruel plans were unfolding, a skill Clementine had watched them develop over years of small betrayals and calculated kindnesses. By Thursday afternoon, Clementine's few belongings were packed in a single worn trunk. Her family gathered on the porch to bid her farewell, their smiles bright and empty as painted china. The hired driver helped her into the wagon seat and clicked his tongue to urge the horses forward. As the familiar landscape rolled past, Clementine found herself thinking not about what she was leaving behind, but about what she might be moving toward. The truth was that Sterling Rhodes intrigued her in ways she couldn't fully explain. She remembered his face from that day at the trading post, the way he'd looked at her when she'd knelt beside that injured dog. While everyone else had seen a dirty dress and improper behavior, his expression had held something different. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The sun was setting when they finally reached the Rhodes property, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. The ranch house stood solid and well-built against the vast landscape, larger than she'd expected, but somehow welcoming rather than imposing. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows into the gathering dusk. Sterling emerged from the house before the wagon had fully stopped, his movements careful and deliberate. He was taller than she remembered, his dark hair slightly longer, his face weathered by years of outdoor work. But his eyes were the same thoughtful brown she recalled, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter in unfamiliar ways. "Miss Shaw," he said, stepping forward to help her down from the wagon. His hand was warm and calloused against hers, strong enough to steady her, but gentle enough that she felt safe rather than overpowered. "Mr. Rhodes," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. Something passed between them in that moment, a spark of mutual assessment that felt like the beginning of an honest conversation. But as the driver unloaded her trunk and Sterling led her toward the house, Clementine couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival had set something in motion that would change both their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The real test would come with whatever happened next. Sterling's house was nothing like what Clementine had expected. The front room held sturdy furniture arranged for comfort rather than show. Shelves lined with books whose worn spines suggested they'd been read rather than displayed, and a stone fireplace that radiated genuine warmth. It felt like a home built by someone who valued substance over appearance. "Are you hungry?" Sterling asked, setting her trunk near the door. "I've got stew warming on the stove." She nodded, surprised by how hungry she actually was. The long wagon ride had left her stiff and tired, but Sterling's quiet presence was oddly soothing. He moved through his kitchen with practiced efficiency, ladling thick stew into bowls and cutting fresh bread with steady hands. They ate in comfortable silence for the first few minutes. But Clementine was acutely aware of how he watched her from across the table, not in the appraising way men sometimes looked at women, as if calculating their worth, but with genuine curiosity, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he found genuinely interesting. "Your family spoke highly of you," he said finally, though something in his tone suggested he was testing the truth of that statement. Clementine set down her spoon and met his gaze directly. "Did they?" Sterling leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Actually, no, they didn't. Your father was eager to make arrangements, but he said very little about you personally. Your mother mentioned that you were practical." "Practical," Clementine repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "That's a kind way of saying unremarkable." "Is it?" Sterling's brown eyes held hers steadily. "I remember you from Peterson's trading post 3 years ago. You tore strips from your own petticoat to bandage a wounded dog while your family told you to leave it alone. That didn't strike me as unremarkable." Heat rose in Clementine's cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else entirely, she couldn't say. You remember that? I remember thinking that anyone who would ruin her dress to help a suffering animal was someone worth knowing better. He paused, his expression growing more serious. I also remember how quickly your family hurried you away from that dog, as if your kindness was something to be ashamed of. Clementine felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. For 3 years, she'd believed that incident had been just another example of her failure to meet her family's expectations. The idea that someone had watched and seen value rather than disappointment was almost too much to process. "Why did you write to my father?" she asked. "Why our family specifically?" Sterling was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "Because I've been looking for someone real. Someone who sees the world as it actually is rather than as it should be. Your family has a reputation for producing beautiful, accomplished daughters. But that day at the trading post, I realized I wasn't interested in beautiful and accomplished." He looked up at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "I was interested and honest." The next morning, Clementine woke to the sound of Sterling moving quietly through the kitchen. Pale dawn light filtered through the small window of the back bedroom, and for a moment she lay still, trying to process where she was and why it felt less frightening than she'd expected. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress and found Sterling at the stove, already preparing breakfast. He looked up when she entered, his hair slightly mussed from sleep, and something warm unfurled in her stomach at the sight of him in this unguarded moment. "Coffee?" he offered, holding up a steaming cup. "Please." She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. "You're up early." "Ranch work starts before sunrise," he said, cracking eggs into a hot pan. "But you don't need to keep those hours. This arrangement is meant to benefit both of us, not make your life harder." Clementine studied his profile as he cooked, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his shoulders moved beneath his work shirt. "What exactly do you hope to gain from this marriage, Mr. Rhodes?" He glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "Call me Sterling, and that's a fair question." He plated the eggs and handed her a fork. "I've spent the last 5 years building this place from nothing. Good land, solid house, enough livestock to support a family. But it's been lonely work. Lonely enough to marry a stranger? Maybe." He sat across from her, his own breakfast untouched. "Or maybe I'm hoping she won't stay a stranger for long." The way he said it made heat spread through Clementine's chest. She'd expected this arrangement to be purely practical, a business transaction that would benefit his reputation and remove her from her family's path. She hadn't anticipated this careful courtesy, this genuine interest in who she was, rather than what she could provide. "Can I ask you something?" Sterling said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Of course. Yesterday, when I helped you down from that wagon, you looked at me like you were trying to decide whether I could be trusted, like you'd learned to be careful about trusting people." He leaned forward slightly. "Was I right about that?" Clementine set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. The question was too perceptive, too close to truth she'd spent years learning to hide. "I've found that people often want things from you that they're not willing to ask for directly. And what do you think I want from you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Clementine looked into his brown eyes and saw something that made her pulse quicken. Not calculation or hunger, but genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been hope. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I don't think it's what my family told you I could give." Sterling reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His skin was warm and rough from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. "What if I told you that what I want most is someone who'll tell me the truth, even when it's uncomfortable? Someone who'll look at a situation and see what's really happening instead of what's convenient to believe." Clementine's breath caught. Those were exactly the qualities her family had spent years trying to discourage, the traits that had made her a problem to be solved rather than a daughter to be cherished. "Then I'd say you might have made a better choice than you realized." After breakfast, Sterling showed Clementine around his property. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of grass and distant rain. She walked beside him as he pointed out the barn, the chicken coop, the pasture where his cattle grazed in peaceful clusters. "It's bigger than I expected," she said, watching a group of horses move across a distant field. "How long did it take you to build all this?" 5 years, Sterling replied, his voice carrying a note of pride. "Started with nothing but the land and a lot of stubborn determination." They paused at a fence overlooking his largest pasture. Clementine rested her arms on the wooden rail, enjoying the simple pleasure of wide open space after years of feeling confined by her family's expectations. Sterling stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to catch the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to follow him. "Can I tell you something?" he said, his voice lower than usual. "Of course. I didn't choose your family at random." Sterling turned to face her, his expression serious. 3 years ago, after that day at Peterson's trading post, I made some inquiries about the Shaw family business dealings. Clementine felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of inquiries?" "The kind that revealed your father has been involved in some questionable land deals. Nothing illegal exactly, but not entirely honest either." Sterling's brown eyes searched her face. "I also learned that you'd been the one to expose several of those deals, sometimes at considerable cost to your family's profits." The pieces clicked together in Clementine's mind with stunning clarity. "You didn't want a wife. You wanted someone who could give you information about my father's business practices." "That's what I thought I wanted," Sterling said quietly. "But I was wrong. How can you be sure?" Instead of answering with words, Sterling reached up and touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her cheek. The gesture was so gentle, so unexpected, that Clementine's breath caught in her throat. She found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes drifting closed for just a moment. "Because somewhere between yesterday and this morning, I stopped caring about your father's business and started caring about you," he said. "The real you. Not what you might know or what you could tell me, but who you are when no one's watching." When Clementine opened her eyes, Sterling was looking at her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "And who am I when no one's watching?" Someone brave enough to help injured animals even when her family disapproves. Someone honest enough to speak up when others won't. Someone beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with what people see on the surface. The word beautiful hung between them, and Clementine felt something shift in her chest. No one had ever called her beautiful before, not in any way that mattered. "What happens now?" she whispered. Sterling's hand was still warm against her cheek, his thumb now tracing her lower lip with devastating gentleness. "Now we decide whether we want to make this real." Clementine covered Sterling's hand with her own, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through her entire body, and she realized that for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen by another person. "I want that too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want this to be real." Sterling's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer until there was barely space between them. "Are you certain? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to being strangers who happen to share a convenient arrangement." Instead of answering with words, Clementine rose on her toes and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, but when Sterling's arms came around her waist and pulled her against him, the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home after years of wandering. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sterling rested his forehead against hers. "I need you to know something," he said. "Whatever brought you here, whatever your family's reasons were for sending you, none of that matters to me anymore. You're not a burden or a problem to be solved. You're exactly what I've been looking for without knowing how to name it." Tears pricked at Clementine's eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. "They sent me away because they thought I was too difficult, too stubborn, too likely to cause trouble for their business dealings. They wanted me gone so badly, they were willing to use me as a cruel joke on a stranger. Then they gave me the greatest gift they could have given," Sterling said, his hands framing her face. "Their loss is my gain." "What about your original plan? The information about my father's business?" Sterling smiled, and there was something almost boyish about the expression. "I've got everything I need right here. Let your father conduct his questionable deals. I've got honest land, honest work, and now an honest woman who's brave enough to tell me when I'm wrong about something. That might happen more often than you expect," Clementine warned, though she was smiling too. "I'm counting on it." 3 weeks later, they were married by the traveling preacher in a simple ceremony with 2 ranch hands as witnesses. Clementine wore her best dress, nothing fancy but clean and well-mended, and Sterling wore his Sunday clothes with his hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. The Shaw family sent no congratulations, no wedding gifts, no acknowledgement that their youngest daughter had found happiness 40 miles from their door. But Clementine didn't mind. She'd found her place with a man who valued her honesty over her appearance, her courage over her compliance, her heart over her family's connections. On their wedding night, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the vast sky above their land, Sterling took her hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked. Clementine squeezed his fingers and smiled. Only that it took us 3 years to have that first real conversation. Well, Sterling said, pulling her closer until she was nestled against his shoulder, we've got the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. And in the quiet comfort of their shared future, that felt like more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable story, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.